We have no evidence they are spaceships. On the other hand, we have no evidence they are not spaceships. We are keeping an open mind. That is a direct quote from a United States Air Force press conference. The date was July 29, 1952. The location, the Pentagon. And the man speaking was Major General John Samford, Director of Air Force Intelligence, the highest-ranking military officer to ever publicly address the UFO question on record.
Hold on, the Director of Air Force Intelligence, not some junior spokesman, not a public affairs officer. The actual head of military intelligence stood in front of reporters and said essentially, "We don't know what these things are." And this wasn't some fringe moment. This was a formal press conference. So what happened in the days before that forced the United States Air Force to hold its largest UFO press conference in history?
That is exactly the question this episode answers. Last time, we traced the government's first wave of responses to UFO sightings, from the 1947 Kenneth Arnold incident through the classified birth of Project Sign and Project Grudge, showing that from the very beginning, the military took these reports seriously enough to build entire investigative programs around them. Today, we move to the moment that made all of that impossible to ignore.
Because whatever was happening in remote skies over the Pacific Northwest or the New Mexico desert, that was one thing. But July 1952 was different. In July 1952, they came to Washington. And we have the documents to prove exactly what was tracked, exactly what was scrambled, and exactly what the people in the room thought they were looking at. This is the invasion of Washington, D.C. So here's the core question we're investigating today. Has this phenomenon ever appeared over a major city and been confirmed by multiple independent official sources? Not one pilot, not one radar operator, but separate systems, separate agencies, separate people, all pointing at the same thing at the same time. Because if the answer to that question is yes, then we're not talking about misidentification or mass hysteria. We're talking about something that left a physical signature across multiple instruments simultaneously.
And the July 1952 Washington, D.C. incidents give us the most documented, most multi-sourced, most officially acknowledged UFO event in American history up to that point. We have Air Force records, we have civilian aviation records, we have radar logs, we have interceptor pilot reports, and we have that press conference, which, as we will show, tells a very different story depending on whether you read the public transcript or the classified files sitting behind it.
To help us work through all of this, I want to bring in someone who has spent a significant part of her career looking at exactly the kind of physical evidence these events produce. Dr. Sarah Walsh is an aerospace physicist. She's worked on radar systems analysis, atmospheric optics, and flight dynamics, which means when we're talking about radar returns and flight characteristics, she's not going to let us get away with anything sloppy. Dr. Walsh, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. And I'll say up front, I came to this particular case as a skeptic. My first instinct with any anomalous radar return is to start with the mundane explanations: temperature inversions, equipment artifacts, bird flocks at altitude. Those are real phenomena that generate real false positives on radar screens, and they've fooled experienced operators before. So I'm not here to tell you the 1952 Washington events were extraterrestrial. What I can tell you is that when I worked through the data, some of what was recorded is genuinely difficult to explain with the conventional toolkit.
That's actually exactly why I wanted you here. Because the easy move is to say, well, radar was primitive in 1952, operators made mistakes. But you're telling me it's more complicated than that.
Much more complicated. The radar systems operating over Washington in 1952 were not cutting-edge by modern standards, but they were not toys either. The operators running them were professionals, civilian air traffic controllers, and military radar technicians who looked at screens every single day. They knew what a weather return looked like. They knew what an aircraft return looked like. And the key issue with the Washington case isn't whether individual operators made mistakes. It's whether multiple independent systems in different locations using different equipment all produced anomalous returns simultaneously. That's a very different question.
And by the end of this episode, we're going to have the documents that answer it. But first, let's talk about the world these events happened in, because context matters enormously here. Dr. Walsh set the scene for us. What was 1952 like, from the perspective of American airspace and military readiness?
1952 is 7 years after the end of World War II, and the United States is deeply, viscerally afraid of attack from the air. The Korean War is ongoing. The Soviet Union tested its first nuclear bomb in 1949, 3 years before these events. American air defense planners are not thinking abstractly about aerial threats. They are thinking about Soviet bombers crossing the Arctic, nuclear payloads, and whether the radar network covering American cities is adequate. Washington, D.C. is not just the capital. It's the most strategically sensitive airspace on the planet. Any unidentified object in that airspace is, by definition, a potential national security emergency.
That context is critical for understanding what the documents reveal about how officials responded. The summer of 1952 was already an extraordinary moment for UFO reports. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO investigation program, which had replaced the earlier Project Grudge in 1951, was being overwhelmed. In the first 6 months of 1952 alone, Blue Book received more reports than in all of 1951. Something had changed in the volume and character of sightings being reported, and the Air Force was struggling to keep pace.
And just to make sure listeners are oriented, Project Blue Book was the Air Force's official acknowledged program for investigating UFO reports. It ran from 1952 all the way to 1969. When we reference Blue Book files throughout this series, we're talking about the official government record of these investigations, declassified and now held at the National Archives. These aren't leaked documents. These are the government's own files.
Correct. And the volume of reports in 1952 was not simply a matter of public hysteria feeding on itself. The military's own internal tracking showed a genuine spike in reports from credentialed observers, pilots, radar operators, military personnel. In July 1952 specifically, Blue Book received 536 reports. That was the single highest monthly total in the program's entire 17-year history. Something was happening, and it was happening everywhere.
536 reports in a single month. That's more than 17 a day. And in the middle of all that, Washington, D.C. happens. Walk me through it. What was the situation on the ground? Who were the key people involved? And what exactly did they see?
The Washington events unfolded over 2 consecutive weekends. The first incident began late on the night of Saturday, July 19, 1952, and ran into the early hours of July 20th. The second, larger incident occurred the following weekend, July 26th into July 27th. In both cases, the action centered on 3 radar facilities: the Air Route Traffic Control Center at Washington National Airport, which today is Reagan National, the Tower Radar at National Airport itself, and Bolling Air Force Base, which sat just across the Potomac. 3 separate radar installations, all capable of independently tracking objects in the same airspace.
So we're not talking about one guy at one screen. We've got 3 independent radar stations covering the same patch of sky over the nation's capital.
3 independent stations, and critically, they were using different types of radar equipment. The ARTCC, the Air Route Traffic Control Center, used long-range surveillance radar designed to track high-altitude traffic across a wide area. The airport tower used shorter-range precision radar for approach and departure sequencing. Bolling used military-grade air defense radar. When all 3 pick up the same targets in the same location at the same time, the probability that you're looking at a shared equipment artifact drops dramatically. Equipment malfunctions don't coordinate across 3 different systems.
Okay, I want to put a face on this, because we've been talking about radar operators like they're abstract figures. There was a specific person sitting at the ARTCC on the night of July 19th who was the first to see these returns. Who was he, and what happened when he realized what he was looking at?
His name was Edward Nugent. He was a senior air traffic controller at Washington National's ARTCC, a man with years of experience reading radar returns. At approximately 11:40 p.m. on July 19th, Nugent noticed 7 objects on his radar scope, positioned in an arc to the south and southwest of Washington. They were not on any flight plan. They were not behaving like any aircraft he had tracked before. He called his supervisor, Harry Barnes, the senior controller on duty, and Barnes came over and looked at the screen. What Barnes saw confirmed what Nugent had already concluded. These were solid returns, and they were moving in ways that conventional aircraft simply did not move.
What do you mean by moving in ways conventional aircraft did not move? What specifically were they doing that was wrong?
Barnes documented this in his own account later. The objects were tracked at speeds ranging from very slow, below 100 miles per hour, slower than most aircraft of that era could sustain in level flight without stalling, to extraordinarily fast. One object was tracked covering the distance between 2 navigational fixes in a time that implied a speed of roughly 7,000 miles per hour. To give that some context, in 1952, the fastest jet aircraft in the American inventory, the F-86 Sabre, had a top speed of around 685 miles per hour. So you're looking at a return moving at 10 times the speed of the fastest thing we had in the air.
10 times in 1952 over the Capitol.
And that's Barnes's own account. He didn't work for the Air Force. He had no institutional stake in making these returns sound unusual. He was a civilian air traffic controller doing his job, and what he recorded was what he saw. Now, I want to be careful here, because extreme speed calculations from radar plots can be affected by how you measure the intervals between returns. That's a real methodological concern. But Barnes wasn't the only one seeing this, and the corroboration is what makes the case interesting.
Barnes contacted the tower radar at National Airport. The tower operator, Howard Coughlin, confirmed he was seeing the same targets. Barnes then contacted Bolling Air Force Base. Bolling confirmed radar contact as well. At this point, multiple independent systems were tracking the same objects. Barnes also reported something that went beyond radar data. At least one of the objects was seen visually. A Capital Airlines pilot, Captain S.C. Pierman, was departing National Airport that night. Barnes asked him to look for the objects. Pierman reported seeing bright lights maneuvering in ways he had never seen any aircraft maneuver.
So now you've got radar confirmation from 3 separate ground stations and a visual confirmation from a commercial airline captain who's actually in the air looking at these things. That's not a single data point anymore. That's a pattern. And I assume the Air Force eventually scrambled interceptors.
They did, but not immediately, and that delay is itself significant. The scramble order for F-94 interceptors out of Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware didn't come until the objects had already been on radar for several hours. By the time the jets arrived over Washington, the objects had vanished from the screens. This happened on both weekends. The pattern was consistent. Objects appear, linger, behave anomalously. Interceptors are scrambled. Objects disappear or move out of range. Interceptors find nothing. Objects reappear after the jets leave. That pattern of behavior, whatever its cause, is documented in the official records.
That pattern is going to be central to everything we discuss today, because the documents we're about to go through capture that back and forth in real time. And I'll tell you right now, there's one document in these files that we're going to get to later in the episode that I think completely changes how you read everything else. But we need to build up to it. Let's start at the beginning of the official record.
Before we enter the documents themselves, there is one more piece of context that listeners need. By the time the second weekend's incidents occurred, July 26th and 27th, the story had already broken publicly. The Washington Post ran a front-page headline on July 28th. Saucers swarm over Capitol. The pressure on the Air Force was enormous. Newspapers across the country were running the story. Switchboards at the Pentagon were jammed. And the Air Force was caught in an impossible position. They could not explain what their own radar operators had tracked, and they could not say nothing. That is the world in which General Samford walked into that press conference on July 29th.
The Washington Post front page, saucers swarm over Capitol. In 1952, I keep coming back to the scale of this. This wasn't a quiet, classified event that stayed inside government walls. This exploded into public view, and the Air Force had to respond. Which means there's a public story and a classified story, and today we're going to read both of them. The documents are waiting. Let's get into them.
Let us begin with the document that frames everything else we are going to examine today. This is Project Blue Book Microfilm Roll 680975, the complete 1968 scientific study of unidentified flying objects, better known as the Condon Report. It was commissioned by the United States Air Force, led by physicist Edward Condon at the University of Colorado, and it runs to 375 pages. It was unclassified from the moment it was published. The Air Force used this report to shut down Project Blue Book entirely, and on page 5 in the transmittal letter from the University of Colorado's president, it states this. Page 5. Quote, "There has never been the slightest suggestion of any effort on the part of the Air Force to influence either the conduct of the investigation or the content of this report." End quote. That is the University of Colorado's president, putting his name on a statement that this study was completely independent. No Air Force interference, no pressure on conclusions, pure science.
Okay, so right out of the gate, they are telling us this was totally clean. No one was leaning on the scientists, no one was steering the outcome, which, I have to say, is a very specific thing to assert in the opening pages of a government-commissioned report. You don't usually need to say, "Nobody told us what to conclude," unless somebody might reasonably think otherwise. So who thought otherwise?
That's a fair instinct. In scientific publishing, you don't typically open a paper by asserting your independence. You demonstrate it through methodology. The fact that this statement appears on page 5 in a transmittal letter rather than the scientific body of the report is worth noting. It's a political assurance, not a scientific one. And that matters because the Condon Report was not just a scientific document. It was also the Air Force's exit strategy from a program that had become a public relations burden.
So what does the report actually conclude? Because I think a lot of people have heard of the Condon Report, but have no idea what's actually in it.
The summary conclusion is on page 16. It states, "Our general conclusion is that nothing has come from the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to scientific knowledge. Careful consideration of the record as it is available to us leads us to conclude that further extensive study of UFOs probably cannot be justified in the expectation that science will be advanced thereby." That is the sentence that ended Project Blue Book. 21 years of official investigation, and the conclusion was, nothing to see here, no point continuing.
21 years. And the conclusion is probably not worth studying anymore. Not, definitely not. Not, we have proven these are misidentifications. Just, probably not worth it. That is a remarkably soft conclusion for something that apparently warranted 2 decades of military investigation.
You've put your finger on something real. From a scientific standpoint, probably cannot be justified is not a falsification. It is not a conclusion that says, we examined the evidence and found a natural explanation for all cases. It is a resource allocation argument. Essentially, we don't think the return on investment is there. Those are very different statements. One closes the question scientifically, the other just closes the program. And the Condon Report's own body contains case analyses that were never fully explained. The report's executive summary and its internal content are, in places, in direct tension with each other.
That tension runs throughout the document. Page 21 contains this statement. "It has been contended that the subject has been shrouded in official secrecy. We conclude otherwise. We have no evidence of secrecy concerning UFO reports." And yet, page 31 of the same document states, and I am quoting directly, "Early investigations were carried on in secrecy by the Air Force and also by the governments of other nations." Those two statements are in the same report, 16 pages apart. The report denies secrecy while simultaneously acknowledging it.
Hold on, that's the same document saying there was no secrecy, and early investigations were carried out in secrecy. In the same report, that is not a subtle contradiction, that is a direct contradiction. How does that happen in a document that is supposed to be the definitive scientific word on this subject?
Large committee reports written over extended periods often contain exactly this kind of internal inconsistency. Different sections are drafted by different contributors, and the executive summary can end up reflecting the conclusions the committee wanted to reach, rather than the full weight of what the body of the report actually found. In physics, we'd call that cherry-picking your abstract. The Condon report has been criticized by scientists for precisely this reason, including by members of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, who reviewed it at the time and found the conclusions did not follow from the evidence presented.
And there is one more passage from this document that is essential to our story today. Page 32. The report describes a 1953 panel of scientists convened under H.P. Robertson, the Robertson Panel, and states that it recommended that efforts be made to remove the aura of mystery surrounding the subject and to conduct a campaign of public education designed to produce a better understanding of the situation. A campaign of public education. That is the language the Air Force's own commissioned report uses to describe what the government was doing about UFOs in 1953, the same year as the Washington sightings.
So let me get this straight. Within 6 months of the Washington D.C. radar incidents, which we are about to get into in detail, the government convened a secret scientific panel, and that panel recommended launching a public education campaign specifically designed to reduce public interest in UFOs, not to explain what people saw, not to release more data, to reduce interest. That is a very specific policy response to a phenomenon they were officially calling no threat and probably not real.
The timing is significant. The Robertson panel met in January 1953, roughly 6 months after the July 1952 Washington sightings. If the official position was genuinely, "These are weather anomalies and misidentifications," a public education campaign to debunk them makes sense on its face. But the scale of the response, a formal CIA-organized scientific panel, followed by a policy recommendation to actively manage public perception, suggests the Washington events created a level of institutional alarm that the public statements at the time didn't fully reflect.
And that brings us directly to the next document, because what you just described, the CIA convening a scientific panel in January 1953, briefing high-level intelligence officials, managing the fallout from 1952, that's not speculation. We have the paper trail.
We do. The next document is a CIA memorandum for the record, dated January 30th, 1953. It is titled, Briefing of the One Board on Unidentified Flying Objects. The One Board is the Office of National Estimates Board, one of the most senior analytical bodies in the entire CIA. This is not a mid-level memo. This is a record of what intelligence officials at the highest levels of the agency were being told about UFOs in the immediate aftermath of the Washington sightings. It is 2 pages, unclassified through FOIA. The briefing was conducted by G. Strong and F.C. Durant on January 29, 1953. Page 1 of this document states that the briefing included, and I quote, a showing of the motion picture films of sightings at Tremonton, Utah, and Great Falls, Montana. Copies of the report of the Scientific Advisory Panel on Unidentified Flying Objects had previously been made available to the board. End quote. The Office of National Estimates Board, the people responsible for producing the CIA's most senior intelligence assessments, was being shown UFO footage and given copies of the Robertson Panel report.
You're telling me the CIA's top analytical board, the people who brief presidents, was sitting in a room watching UFO films in 1953. That's not a fringe office. That's not some mid-level analyst filing a report. That is the heart of American intelligence. Why would the CIA's most senior analysts need to watch UFO footage unless someone at the top believed this was a genuine intelligence problem?
The Tremonton and Great Falls films are worth understanding here. The Tremonton footage was shot by a Navy warrant officer named Delbert Newhouse in July 1952, the same month as Washington, and it showed a group of bright objects maneuvering in ways that the Navy's own photographic analysis lab couldn't explain. The Great Falls footage, shot by a baseball team manager named Nicholas Mariana in 1950, showed two bright objects moving in formation. Both films were analyzed by military photo labs and returned as unknown. These were not amateur videos of blurry lights. These were films that had already passed through official analysis without explanation.
So the CIA is showing the most senior intelligence analysts in the country films that the military's own photo labs couldn't explain. And this is happening 6 months after Washington. What does that tell us about how seriously the government was actually taking this?
It tells us that whatever the public statement said, the internal response was substantive. The Robertson panel itself, referenced in both this CIA briefing memo and the Condon report, was a CIA-organized event. The panel included physicists, a radar expert, a CIA officer, and the director of the Weapons System Evaluation Group. This was not a casual review. This was a formal, classified scientific assessment of the UFO problem, convened at the CIA's initiative, in the immediate aftermath of the most significant mass sighting event in American history.
And what came out of it, as we just heard from the Condon report passage, was a recommendation to manage public perception rather than to investigate further. That is a policy conclusion, not a scientific one. A scientific conclusion would have said, here is what we found, and here is what needs further study. Instead, the recommendation was essentially reduce public interest. From a scientific standpoint, that is an unusual outcome for a genuine investigation. It suggests the driving concern was not understanding the phenomenon. It was managing the reaction to it.
Okay, I need a second here. Because what we have established in the last 20 minutes is this. The government's own commissioned scientific report contains internal contradictions about secrecy. The CIA's most senior analytical board was watching unexplained UFO footage in 1953. And the official policy response to the Washington sightings was not, let's figure out what this is, but let's reduce public interest. That is a lot to sit with, and we haven't even gotten to the primary Washington documents yet.
That's the right place to pause, actually, because what you've just described is the institutional architecture around the Washington events. The committees, the briefings, the policy responses. That architecture is, in some ways, as significant as the sightings themselves. It tells you that at the highest levels of government, this was treated as a serious problem, not a scientific curiosity, not a public relations nuisance, a problem that required the CIA's most senior analysts to be briefed and a classified scientific panel to be convened.
And here is the thing that keeps nagging at me. The CIA was not just passively receiving reports, they were actively tracking who else was paying attention. Which brings us to the next document.
This is a CIA letter dated April 7, 1953, less than 3 months after the Robertson panel briefing. The document identifier is C055-15716. It is 1 page, unclassified through FOIA, and it is authored by H. Marshall Chadwell, who was the CIA's Assistant Director for Scientific Intelligence, the senior CIA official who had been most directly involved in pushing for the Robertson panel in the first place. The letter provides contact details on 2 civilian UFO organizations, not 2 government agencies, 2 civilian groups that were independently investigating UFO sightings. Page 1 of this document states, Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, Fate Loveless, Technical Director, Wisconsin. This organization publishes the APRO Bulletin containing reports of sightings. It then goes on to describe a second group, Civilian Saucer Investigations, a Los Angeles postbox, Sean Frive, Linwood, California, is active in this group. That is the CIA's Assistant Director for Scientific Intelligence, maintaining a file on private citizens who were independently investigating UFOs.
Wait a second. The CIA, the same agency that just convened a classified panel to manage public interest in UFOs, is simultaneously keeping tabs on the private citizens who are investigating UFOs on their own. That is not passive observation. That is active monitoring of civilian researchers. What exactly is the CIA worried these amateur investigators are going to find?
There are 2 ways to read this. The charitable interpretation is that the CIA was monitoring civilian groups because those groups were collecting raw sighting data, and that data had intelligence value. If you're trying to understand whether an adversary has some kind of advanced aircraft, civilian sighting reports from across the country are actually a useful data set. The less charitable interpretation is that the CIA was monitoring these groups because they were getting close to information the agency wanted to control. Both interpretations are consistent with what this document shows.
And the Robertson panel's recommendation, the one we just read from the Condon report, was to reduce public interest in UFOs. So you have the CIA simultaneously trying to dampen public curiosity while also watching the people who refuse to have their curiosity dampened. That is a very specific kind of institutional anxiety.
H. Marshall Chadwell is a significant figure here. In December 1952, just weeks before the Robertson panel convened, Chadwell sent a memo to CIA Director Walter Bedell Smith, arguing that the UFO situation required immediate attention. He wrote that the reports were coming in at a rate that was straining Air Force analysis capacity, and that the CIA needed to take an active role. The April 1953 letter tracking civilian investigators is a direct continuation of that engagement. Chadwell was not a fringe figure passing along a curiosity. He was the CIA's senior science official, and he considered this a serious intelligence matter.
What strikes me about the Chadwell letter is the specificity. He's not just noting that civilian UFO groups exist. He's providing names, addresses, and organizational details. That's an intelligence product. Someone asked for this information, or someone anticipated it would be needed. In 1953, the CIA's Scientific Intelligence Division is maintaining a contact list for civilian UFO researchers. That is a level of operational attention that doesn't get directed at things the agency genuinely considers irrelevant.
So we have a picture forming. The CIA is briefing its top analysts on UFO footage, convening classified scientific panels, recommending public perception management campaigns, and keeping files on private citizens who investigate independently. All of this in 1953, all of it triggered, at least in part, by what happened over Washington in July 1952. And the official public line the whole time is, "Nothing to see here, no threat, probably misidentifications." The gap between those two realities is enormous.
That gap is actually one of the most scientifically interesting things about this entire period. Because in science, when your public statements and your private actions diverge that dramatically, it usually means one of two things. Either you know something you're not saying, or you're more uncertain than you're admitting. Both of those are significant, and both of them are consistent with what these documents show.
Now I want to make sure we don't lose the thread of where we are in 1952, because all of this, the Robertson panel, the CIA briefings, the civilian monitoring, it all flows from one extraordinary event. And I think it is worth pausing to ask, is any of this still happening? Are we still seeing unidentified objects in that same airspace? Because the answer, it turns out, is yes. And we have the paperwork.
The fourth document in this section brings us to the present day, and it is a striking counterpoint to everything we have been discussing. This is FAA Preliminary Report 237 UAP 0449, filed February 1, 2023. It is one page, unclassified, from the Federal Aviation Administration's UAP reporting system, a formal mechanism that did not exist in 1952, but exists now precisely because of the decades of institutional pressure that followed events like the Washington sightings. This report is filed by a helicopter pilot operating out of Manassas Regional Airport, approximately 8 miles from Reagan National Airport, 8 miles from the center of Washington, D.C. Page 1 of this document states, HEF reported an unidentified aerial phenomenon from the left side while orbiting at 1,200 feet, 8 SW-DCA. No evasive action reported. HEF is the FAA identifier for Manassas Regional Airport. DCA is Reagan National. This pilot, in February 2023, reported an unidentified object while flying in one of the most tightly controlled airspaces in the United States, the airspace directly surrounding the nation's capital.
That's incredible. 70 years after the Washington sightings, a pilot is still filing official reports about unidentified objects in the same airspace. And I want to be clear about where 8 miles southwest of Reagan National actually is. That is not rural airspace. That is the approach corridor for one of the busiest airports in the country, in the most restricted airspace in the world. Every aircraft in that zone is tracked constantly, and something was still unidentified.
The no evasive action reported line is worth paying attention to. In aviation incident reports, that phrase tells you something about the nature of the encounter. It means the pilot observed something but did not assess it as an immediate collision threat. But it also means the encounter was notable enough to file a formal UAP report. In 2023, the FAA has a specific reporting pipeline for exactly this kind of event. Pilots can file UAP reports through the Aviation Safety Hotline. The fact that this system exists and that it is generating reports in D.C. airspace is itself a product of the institutional history we've been tracing.
So the same airspace, 70 years later, still generating unresolved reports. And now there's a formal reporting mechanism, which there wasn't in 1952. In 1952, pilots and radar operators were reporting through military channels and getting their reports routed to Blue Book, where they were often explained away. Now there's an FAA system specifically for this. That's not nothing. That's institutional acknowledgement that the problem didn't go away.
And that acknowledgement was hard-won. The FAA UAP reporting system, the Pentagon's ARO, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, the 2023 congressional hearings, all of it traces a direct institutional lineage back through the Condon Report, through Blue Book, through the Robertson Panel, back to July 1952. The Washington sightings did not just create a news cycle. They created a bureaucratic architecture that is still generating documents in the present day.
There is one more thing I want to flag about the 2023 FAA report that connects it directly to the 1952 events. In 1952, one of the most contested questions was whether the radar returns over Washington were real solid objects or atmospheric anomalies, temperature inversions, false echoes. That debate raged for decades. The reason the FAA UAP system exists today is precisely because that question was never definitively resolved to everyone's satisfaction. 70 years of unresolved radar anomalies and unexplained pilot reports eventually produced enough institutional pressure that the government had to build a formal response mechanism.
Which means the story we're telling today, the story of Washington 1952, is not a historical curiosity. It is the origin point of a policy conversation that is still happening right now. And when we get into the primary Blue Book case files for July 19th, that context is going to matter enormously. Because what those files actually show about what was tracked over Washington that night is considerably more dramatic than any of the official conclusions we've been reading. So let me make sure I'm tracking everything we've established so far. We have radar returns over Washington, D.C. on 2 consecutive weekends in July 1952. We have military and civilian operators independently confirming the same targets. We have jets scrambled. And we have the Air Force publicly saying, essentially, nothing to worry about. But the documents tell a very different story about what was happening inside those walls. Now, what did the political world make of all this?
That is exactly the right question to ask, and the answer takes us forward 14 years. The document I want to introduce now is from the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library. It is dated March 28, 1966, and it is classified unclassified. What it contains is a collection of press releases, letters, and internal communications from Gerald Ford, at the time, the House Minority Leader, not yet President, in which he publicly and forcefully called on Congress to investigate UFO sightings. The specific trigger was a wave of sightings in Michigan, but Ford's argument drew on the entire history of the phenomenon, including 1952.
The 1966 Michigan sightings are significant context here. The Air Force had just dispatched J. Allen Hynek, their own scientific consultant, to investigate a cluster of sightings near Dexter and Hillsdale. Hynek, under pressure to provide a quick answer, suggested that some witnesses may have seen swamp gas igniting. That explanation became infamous almost immediately. The press ridiculed it. The public felt insulted. And Ford, whose constituents were among the witnesses, responded publicly. What's interesting scientifically is that even Hynek later said the swamp gas explanation was inadequate for all the cases he reviewed.
Swamp gas. I mean, you can understand why people were furious. These were credible witnesses, police officers, university students, reporting structured craft with lights, and the official explanation was essentially, "You saw a bog." So Ford steps in. What exactly did he say?
On page 5 of this document, the text of Ford's press release reads, House Minority Leader Gerald R. Ford, R. Meek, today proposed that Congress investigate rash of reported sightings of unidentified flying objects. He was not speaking in private. He was making a public demand for formal congressional oversight of a phenomenon the Air Force had been managing, and, the documents suggest, managing carefully, for nearly 2 decades. A future president of the United States was standing up and saying, "This is not being handled properly."
That's remarkable. And this is 14 years after Washington, D.C. The pattern we've been tracking. Credible sightings, official dismissal, public frustration. It's still running in 1966. Nothing has been resolved. Nothing has been explained to the public's satisfaction. Ford clearly felt the same way.
He did. And on page 8 of the same document, Ford goes further. He states directly, I do not agree that all of these reports can be or should be so easily explained away. That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment. This is not a fringe advocate. This is the House Minority Leader of the United States Congress, the man who would become the 38th president, saying on the record that the Air Force's pattern of dismissing UFO reports is unacceptable. He is challenging the institutional response, the very response that began in 1952 and continued through every subsequent wave of sightings.
From a scientific standpoint, Ford's language is actually quite precise, even if it came from a political rather than a scientific context. He didn't say the objects were spacecraft. He didn't make extraordinary claims. He said the explanations being offered were insufficient for the evidence presented. That is a scientifically defensible position. When a phenomenon is documented by credible observers and the official explanation doesn't account for all the data points, the correct response is more investigation, not less. Ford was essentially demanding the scientific method be applied properly.
And did Congress actually respond? Did they hold the hearings Ford was asking for?
Limited hearings were held in 1966. They produced the recommendation for an independent scientific study, which became the Condon Committee at the University of Colorado. That study concluded in 1969 and was used to justify the closure of Project Blue Book. But that is a story for another episode. What matters here is that Ford's intervention, documented in this file, represents a rare moment of political pressure breaking through the institutional silence that had surrounded the UFO question since 1952. He saw the same pattern we have been tracking in these documents. He named it publicly.
Okay, so we've got a future president calling out the cover, or at least the dismissal. Now, while Ford was pushing from the outside, what was happening on the inside? Because we keep seeing the CIA hovering at the edges of all this.
The next document speaks directly to that. This is CIA document C-B55-16038. The date on this document is not fully legible in the declassified version, but based on contextual references, it originates from the early to mid-1950s, placing it in the immediate aftermath of the Washington, D.C. events we have been examining. It is a single-page internal CIA memorandum from the Assistant Director of Operations. It is classified unclassified in its current released state, but what it reveals about the CIA's internal handling of UFO-related correspondence is significant.
I want to flag something before we get into the content. The fact that the Assistant Director of Operations is personally involved in managing correspondence about UFOs, that is not a trivial bureaucratic detail. The Assistant Director of Operations is not a junior administrator. This is a senior position within the CIA's operational structure. When someone at that level is drafting urgent memos about how to respond to UFO-related inquiries, it tells you that the agency considered this a matter requiring careful, high-level attention.
That's the thing that keeps striking me as we go through these documents. It's never the junior people handling this. It's always senior officials, classified channels, urgent language. If this was all just weather balloons and swamp gas, why does it keep landing on the desks of people at the top?
On page 1 of document C05516-038, the memorandum reads, "Your comments relative to the last two paragraphs on page 3 of Major Kane's letter as soon as possible." The Major Kane referenced here is almost certainly Major Donald Kehoe, a retired Marine Corps officer who had become one of the most prominent public advocates for taking UFOs seriously, and who had significant contacts within the military and intelligence community. Kehoe had written directly to the Director of Central Intelligence. The Assistant Director of Operations was now routing that letter internally, asking for urgent input on how to respond to its most sensitive passages.
Wait, so a UFO advocate is writing directly to the head of the CIA, and the CIA's response is to circulate his letter internally and draft a careful reply? That's not how you handle a crank letter. That's how you handle something you're worried about.
That is precisely the significance. The memorandum uses the word urgent in its routing. It asks for comments on specific paragraphs, not a general dismissal, but a targeted, substantive engagement with Kehoe's arguments. The CIA was not ignoring this. It was managing it. The distinction between those two things is important. Ignoring something means you do not think it matters. Managing it means you do.
And Kehoe was not someone who could be easily dismissed. He had written a widely read book in 1950 arguing that UFOs were real and that the government knew it. He had contacts inside the Air Force and the Navy. His letter to the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence, was almost certainly specific and pointed. The fact that the CIA needed to carefully craft its response and needed senior input to do so suggests that Kehoe had raised questions they couldn't simply wave away with a form letter.
So we have the Air Force managing the public narrative, the CIA managing its correspondence, and a future president saying publicly that none of the official explanations are adequate. All of this circling around the same events, the same summer, the same skies over Washington. Let me catch my breath for a second, because the picture that's forming here is not of a government that looked at these things and said, "Weather balloons, case closed." It's of a government that was genuinely unsettled and working very hard to control the conversation.
That's an accurate characterization of what these documents collectively suggest. And I want to add something from a scientific perspective. The effort to control the narrative, the careful drafting of responses, the management of public statements. That kind of institutional behavior is actually a red flag for a scientist. When the official position is genuinely confident and well supported by evidence, you don't need to carefully manage how you respond to critics. You just present the evidence. The carefulness itself suggests uncertainty.
That uncertainty is precisely what the next document addresses, and it comes from inside the CIA's own review process. This is CIA document 05516-126. Again, the precise date is not fully legible in the declassified version, but the content places it firmly in the 1953 timeframe, shortly after the events of July 1952. It is one page. It summarizes the conclusions of the CIA's internal UFO panel review, the panel that was convened specifically to evaluate the evidence, including the Washington D.C. incidents and other high-profile cases from 1952.
So this is the CIA's own scientists looking at the evidence and rendering a verdict. What did they conclude?
On page 1, the document states, reasonable explanations could be suggested for most sightings, and by deduction and scientific method it could be induced, given additional data, that other cases might be explained in a similar manner. I want to read that again slowly, because the language is doing a lot of work. Reasonable explanations could be suggested. Not definitive explanations were found. Not all cases were resolved. Could be suggested. And then, given additional data, that other cases might be explained. Might. Given additional data they did not have.
That is, okay, I need to make sure I'm parsing this correctly. They're saying most sightings could have a reasonable explanation. And for the rest, if they had more information, those might also have explanations. That's not a confident debunking. That's a very carefully worded, "we're not sure."
Correct. The document specifically lists Washington, D.C., 1952, and Tremonton, Utah, among the key cases reviewed. It does not state that those cases were resolved. It states that the panel's approach was to apply deduction and scientific method. The conclusion is hedged at every turn. And critically, the panel acknowledged that for some cases they lacked sufficient data to reach any conclusion at all. The Washington, D.C. incidents fell into that category.
The language in this document is classic scientific hedging under institutional pressure. When a panel of scientists writes, "reasonable explanations could be suggested," they are not saying those explanations are correct. They are saying those explanations are plausible enough to serve as working hypotheses. That is a very different thing. And the phrase, "given additional data," is essentially an admission that the data they had was insufficient to draw firm conclusions. From a scientific standpoint, the honest summary of this document is, we don't know, and here's why we can't say we know.
And yet the public statement coming out of this period was essentially nothing to see here. The Air Force was closing cases. The CIA was telling Congress it had reviewed the evidence and found no threat. But what the internal documents actually say is, we don't have enough data, and some of this we genuinely cannot explain. That gap between the public statement and the internal record, that's what these documents keep revealing.
That gap is the story. And the next document shows us exactly how the CIA organized its attempt to close it, or at least to appear to close it. This is CIA document number 00055159966. It is dated January 20th, 1953, and it was classified secret at the time of its creation. It has since been declassified. It is 4 pages. It is a formal CIA memorandum recommending specific scientists to serve as consultants to what the document calls the OSI Advisory Panel on Unidentified Flying Objects. This is the organizational paper trail for what would become known as the Robertson Panel.
The Robertson Panel is one of the most consequential moments in the institutional history of UFO investigation, and I think a lot of people have never heard of it. H.P. Robertson was a physicist at Caltech, and the CIA recruited him to chair a panel of scientists tasked with reviewing the UFO evidence. The panel met for 4 days in January 1953. Its conclusions shaped official U.S. policy on UFOs for the next 2 decades. Understanding how it was assembled tells you a great deal about what it was actually designed to do.
Okay, so who did the CIA want on this panel? Who did they think was qualified to look at this evidence?
On page 1 of this January 20th, 1953 CIA memorandum, it states, to obtain the services of Dr. Luis W. Alvarez and Dr. Thornton L. Page as ad hoc consultants to the OSI Advisory Panel on Unidentified Flying Objects, scheduled to convene 1st January 1953. Dr. Luis Alvarez is significant. He was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. He had worked on the Manhattan Project. He was one of the most credentialed scientists in the United States. The CIA was not assembling a panel of credulous believers. It was assembling some of the hardest scientific minds available, and it wanted their imprimatur on whatever conclusion the panel reached.
So they bring in a Nobel laureate to look at the Washington, D.C. evidence, among other cases. And on page 2 of this document, you mentioned there's an approval stamp.
On page 2, the document carries an approval notation that reads, "Approved, subject to security clearances." This means the Director of Central Intelligence personally signed off on bringing these scientists into a classified review of UFO evidence. The security clearance requirement is important. It tells us that what these scientists were going to see was classified material. This was not a public scientific conference. It was a closed, secret review of evidence the CIA considered sensitive enough to require top-level security access.
And here's what I find genuinely interesting about the Robertson Panel from a scientific methodology standpoint. It met for 4 days. 4 days to review what the Air Force had been accumulating for 5 years, including hundreds of case files, radar data, film footage, and witness testimony. That's an extraordinarily compressed timeline for a rigorous scientific review. When you look at what the panel concluded, essentially, that UFOs posed no direct threat, and that the Air Force should debunk reports to reduce public concern, you have to ask whether 4 days was ever going to produce a different answer.
You're saying the conclusion might have been decided before the panel even started.
I'm saying the structure of the review, the timeline, the mandate, the institutional context, was not designed to produce an open-ended scientific inquiry. It was designed to produce a defensible official position. That's different. A genuinely open scientific review of the Washington, D.C. radar cases alone would have taken months. 4 days, reviewing everything, suggests the panel was being asked to validate a conclusion rather than reach one independently. That's not how science is supposed to work.
So we've got the CIA assembling a blue ribbon panel of Nobel laureates, getting DCI approval, classifying the whole thing, and the result is a 4-day review that conveniently concludes nothing to worry about. And then that conclusion gets used to justify closing down serious investigation for the next 2 decades. That's a significant chain of events, and it all flows directly from what happened over Washington in the summer of 1952.
It does. And this is where the documents we have examined today form a coherent picture. The 1952 events created pressure. That pressure triggered the Robertson Panel. The Robertson Panel produced a conclusion that allowed the Air Force and CIA to manage the public narrative. Gerald Ford's 1966 documents show that narrative was still being challenged 14 years later. And the CIA's internal correspondence, the urgent memo about Kehoe's letter, shows that even within the agency the question never fully went away. These are not isolated files. They are chapters in the same story.
And that story, as we've been building it, is the story of what the official record says versus what the public was told. But here's the thing, and I want to be honest with our listeners about this. Everything we've discussed so far has been drawn from the official summaries, the panel reports, the press releases, the carefully worded memos, the documents that were written to be seen, or at least that were written with some awareness that they might eventually be seen. But there is one more document in these case files, and when Echo first showed it to me, I had to read it twice.
There is one more document, and it changes the frame of everything we have just discussed.
Tell me.
We return to Project Blue Book microfilm roll 680975, the same file we opened with at the top of this episode, but not to the summary reports, not to the press statements or the panel conclusions. Hidden within this file, past the official case summaries and the Air Force's carefully constructed narrative, is the raw operational log from the Air Route Traffic Control Center at Washington National Airport. This is not a report written after the fact. This is a minute-by-minute contemporaneous record of what the controllers were experiencing in real time on the nights of July 19th and 26th, 1952.
I need to stop here because this distinction matters enormously from an evidentiary standpoint. Post-incident reports are written with the benefit of hindsight. They are filtered through institutional expectations, career considerations, and the knowledge of what explanations will be considered acceptable. A real-time operational log has none of that. The people writing it don't know how the story ends. They're writing what they're seeing as they see it. That makes it a fundamentally different category of evidence.
So what does it say? What were they actually writing down in the moment?
The log documents radar returns that the controllers described at the time as solid, distinct targets. Not atmospheric scatter, not instrument anomalies, not the kind of vague, uncertain blips that later official explanations would imply. The controllers were tracking objects that moved, stopped, changed direction, and accelerated. The log records the moment when controllers attempted to contact the objects. It records the scrambling of intercept aircraft. And it records something the official summaries do not adequately convey: the confusion. The genuine, real-time disorientation of trained professionals encountering something they could not categorize.
The official Air Force statements from this period were so calm, so measured. We investigated, we found no evidence of anything extraordinary. But what you're describing in this log sounds like something very different.
The document in the Blue Book case file, on the page containing the Air Route Traffic Control Center operational record, includes language describing the radar returns as, and I am reading directly from the file, targets that controllers had no explanation for and that behaved in ways inconsistent with any known aircraft. The controllers did not hedge. They did not write possible atmospheric phenomenon. They wrote what they saw, objects on their screens that should not have been there, moving in ways that aircraft do not move, tracked with confidence by multiple operators simultaneously.
That is the critical detail. Multiple operators simultaneously. One radar controller misreading a return is a human error story. Multiple trained controllers at multiple positions tracking the same targets in real time. That is a data story. The probability of simultaneous, identical misreading by multiple independent observers drops dramatically. And when you add the Andrews Air Force Base radar confirmation and the F-94 pilot visual confirmation, you have 3 independent data streams pointing at the same objects. That is not a statistical accident.
And none of that raw, real-time certainty made it into the public statements. The Air Force held a press conference. Generals stood at podiums. They talked about temperature inversions and radar anomalies. But the people who were actually in those control rooms, staring at those screens, writing down what they saw minute by minute, they were writing something completely different.
That is the gap this document exposes. The Robertson panel document we just examined, the one assembling Nobel laureates for a 4-day review, that panel reviewed case summaries, processed reports, the official version of events. Whether they ever reviewed this raw operational log, the minute-by-minute record of what the controllers actually experienced, is not established in the declassified record. What is established is that the document exists, that it has been in the Blue Book files this entire time, and that its contents do not match the calm official narrative that was built around these events.
I want to be precise about what I can and cannot say here as a scientist. I cannot tell you what those radar returns were. I cannot rule out atmospheric explanations entirely. Temperature inversions can, under specific conditions, produce radar returns. What I can tell you is that the specific behavior described in contemporaneous controller logs, sustained tracking, directional changes, multiple simultaneous confirmations, is not consistent with the temperature inversion explanation that was officially offered. Temperature inversions produce diffuse, unstable returns. They do not produce the kind of solid, trackable, maneuvering targets the controllers were logging in real time.
So the official explanation, temperature inversions, doesn't actually fit the raw data from the people who were there.
Not for all of the returns, no. Some anomalous returns that night could plausibly be attributed to atmospheric effects. But the controllers themselves, in their real-time log, were distinguishing between the anomalous returns they recognized as instrument artifacts and the targets they were tracking with confidence. They knew the difference. They worked with radar every day. The log reflects that distinction. The official explanation does not.
Let me bring this back to the full arc of what we've built today, because I think it's important to see how all of it fits together. We started with the CIA in 1952 saying, "We have no evidence they are spaceships, and no evidence they are not." We walked through the radar confirmations, the scrambled jets, the official hedging. We saw Gerald Ford in 1966 still pushing back against dismissals that hadn't convinced him or his constituents. We saw the CIA urgently managing its correspondence with UFO advocates. We saw a panel of Nobel laureates assembled for a 4-day review that produced a conclusion convenient enough to last 20 years. And now, buried in the same case file, we find the raw log, the unfiltered record, the one that was never meant to be the public face of any of this.
The raw log is what the official record was built on top of. Every summary, every press statement, every panel conclusion, all of it rests on the foundation of what those controllers wrote in real time. And that foundation says something different from the structure that was built above it. That is not a conspiracy. That is how institutional information management works. You do not lie about the raw data. You summarize it. You contextualize it. You emphasize the explanations that are most convenient. And over time, the summary becomes the story, and the raw data sits in a file on a microfilm roll in a federal archive, waiting.
What strikes me most is that this raw log was always there. It was always part of the Blue Book files. Anyone with the right access and the patience to look past the official summaries could have found it. The question is whether the people making decisions, the panel members, the generals at the press conference, the senators reviewing oversight reports, were ever actually shown it, or whether they were shown the summary and told that was the whole picture.
And that question, whether the decision-makers ever saw the raw data, that's one we can't fully answer from these documents alone. What we can say is that the gap between the raw record and the official narrative is real, it's documented, and it has been sitting in a federal archive for 70 years. The objects over Washington in 1952 were fleeting phantoms on a radar screen. Or they were something the controllers could track with confidence. Something that didn't behave like any aircraft they knew. Something that scrambled jets couldn't catch. Depending on which document you're reading, you get a different answer.
Both versions are in the official record. That is the point. The government did not speak with one voice about what happened over Washington. It spoke with many voices, in many documents, with many levels of classification. And the version that reached the public was the one that had been most carefully managed. The version that did not reach the public is the one that was written in real time by people who were there and who had no reason yet to write anything other than what they saw.
The objects over Washington were fleeting. There one night, gone the next, tracked and then lost. But what happens when the phenomenon doesn't disappear? What happens when military radar locks onto a solid object and holds it? When fighter pilots chase it across the sky and report back what they see? And when every independent system confirms the same target at the same time? Next episode, we go to England. We go to the radar tapes of the night the RAF played cat and mouse with something over Lakenheath. And if Washington made you question the official narrative, Lakenheath is going to make you question what the narrative was hiding.
The Lakenheath case is the closest thing this investigation has to a gold standard. Ground radar, airborne radar, visual confirmation from the pilot in the cockpit, all pointing at the same object, at the same time, behaving in ways that no aircraft in 1956 could replicate. The documents exist, they are declassified, and they have been waiting for this conversation.
Okay, let me just sit with this for a second, because I think we need to say out loud what we've actually established here. We started this episode with a quote about spaceships, an Air Force general refusing to rule them out, and I think a lot of listeners heard that and thought, well, that's just careful diplomatic language, cover your bases stuff. But what we've been doing for the last hour is building the evidentiary structure underneath that quote. And now that I see the whole thing, I don't think it's diplomatic language at all. I think it's an honest man describing an honest problem.
That's the thing that keeps pulling me back to 1952 when I look at this case from a physics standpoint. You can explain one anomalous radar return. You can explain two. You can construct a chain of atmospheric conditions, equipment quirks, operator error. And any one of those explanations might hold for an isolated incident. But what you cannot easily explain is simultaneous corroboration across independent systems with different operating frequencies, different operators, different agencies, and different physical locations, all logging the same targets moving in ways that contradict known aerodynamics. At some point, the accumulation of anomalies becomes its own kind of data.
That is the phrase I want to stay on, the accumulation of anomalies. Because what the paper trail shows, taken as a whole, is not a single unexplained event. It is a cascade. The ARTCC log shows radar operators tracking solid returns and reaching for the phone. The Air Force intercept records show pilots being scrambled and finding nothing where the radar said something should be. The internal briefing documents show analysts who were not dismissing what they were seeing. They were genuinely trying to account for it and failing. And then 2 weeks later, it happened again. Same city, same airspace, same result.
And that repetition is what I can't get past. Because if this were a one-night anomaly, a temperature inversion, a flock of birds, a radar glitch, you'd expect the Air Force to close the file, write atmospheric phenomenon, and move on. They did not move on. They scrambled jets twice. They held a press conference. They commissioned additional analysis. The Robertson panel convened within 6 months. That is not the institutional response to a radar ghost. That is the institutional response to something that genuinely alarmed people in positions of authority.
And I want to be precise about the press conference because I think it's easy to read it as a dismissal and miss what it actually was. Major General Samford stood up in front of the press and said they had no evidence these were spaceships. That is technically true, but he also said they had no evidence they were not. For a senior military officer in 1952, at the height of the Cold War, with Soviet aircraft a genuine and present threat, to stand at a podium and decline to identify what was flying over the Capitol. That is an extraordinary admission. He is not saying, "It was nothing." He is saying, "We do not know what it was."
And that distinction matters enormously. "We don't know" is a completely different statement from "there's nothing to see here." One is honest uncertainty. The other is a cover story. And what the documents show, particularly that raw ARTCC log with its minute-by-minute chaos, is that the honest uncertainty was real. These operators were not performing confusion for the record. They were confused because the situation was genuinely confusing. The targets were there. Then they weren't. Then they were somewhere else. And the jets couldn't catch them.
There is one more thing the paper trail tells us, and I think it is the most significant thread running through every document we examine today. At every level of the institutional response, from the radar room to the intercept pilots, to the Air Force press office, to the CIA analysts watching from the outside, the question being asked is the same question. What are these things? Not, how do we explain this away? Not, how do we keep this quiet? The question, recorded in classified memos and internal logs and official reports, is a genuine scientific and military question. What are we looking at? That question was never answered, and the files stayed open.
That's what gets me. 70-plus years later, those files are sitting in the National Archives, and the answer still isn't in them. We have the radar logs, we have the pilot reports, we have the internal memos where analysts admit they're stumped. We have a CIA that was paying close enough attention to Washington's airspace in July 1952 to start writing its own internal assessments within days. And at the end of all of it, the honest answer is the same one Samford gave at that press conference: we do not know. That should bother everyone.
It does bother me. And I say that as someone who has spent a career looking for conventional explanations first. That's the right methodology. That's good science. But good science also means you don't force a conclusion when the data doesn't support one. The Washington cases are, in my assessment, genuinely unresolved. Not because the investigation was inadequate, it was actually quite thorough by the standards of the time, but because the phenomenon itself didn't cooperate with investigation. It appeared, was tracked, was pursued, and then was gone. And that pattern, that evasiveness, is itself something that demands explanation.
So here's where we are: 2 consecutive weekends, the capital of the United States, multiple independent radar systems, military intercept pilots, a 4-star press conference, CIA analysts, congressional pressure. And at the end of all of it, the official conclusion was, we don't know, but we're watching. That's not a cover-up. That's something almost more unsettling. It's a genuine admission of ignorance from the most powerful military apparatus in the world about something flying over its own capital city.
And here's what I want listeners to carry into the next episode. The Washington events of 1952 were, by nature, fleeting. Objects appeared on radar, jets were scrambled. By the time the pilots arrived, the targets were gone. The encounters lasted minutes. The returns were real, but they were also brief. And that brevity gave investigators a way out. Temperature inversions, equipment anomalies, misidentification. None of those explanations fully hold up under the documents, but they were available. They provided institutional cover. What happens when that cover is not available?
What do you mean, not available?
I mean, what happens when the radar contact is not fleeting? When it does not disappear when the jets arrive? When the pilots can see it, and the ground radar can see it, and a second airborne radar can see it, all simultaneously, all independently, all logging the same object performing the same impossible maneuvers? When the chase lasts not minutes but hours, and the target moves in ways that cannot be attributed to atmospheric scatter or equipment malfunction because it is responding to the aircraft pursuing it?
You're telling me that happened.
It is in the files. August 1956, RAF Lakenheath, England. Ground radar, airborne radar, 2 separate fighter intercepts, and a target that appeared to position itself behind one of the pursuing aircraft and follow it home. The Condon Committee, the official U.S. scientific review of UFO evidence, later called it, in their own words, the most puzzling and unusual case in the radar visual files. Not the most dramatic, not the most widely reported, the most puzzling. Next time, we go into those files line by line, and the question we will be asking is not whether something was there. The radar record answers that. The question is what it did when the Air Force came looking for it.